There's kind of like a missing explanation in some of the research about exactly when the child dies versus when the organs are harvested.
They have to have gotten those fetal cell lines from living fetal tissue.
It takes away the responsibility that men should also have when it comes to reproduction. It really lets them off the hook.
Women say things all the time like, well, my body has never worked.
Are all IUDs abortifacient?
They are, every single one.
Women just need to know that you're good. You're good the way you were created.
So they will never regret carrying to term.
It's wrought with places that they can go wrong and ethical traps.
Covering the world of reproductive technology, the women who bear new life, the scientists who try to create it, and the perilous journeys of the embryos themselves. Welcome to Season 2 of Brave New Us.
Bridget, welcome to Brave New Us.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
It's great to have you. Can we start by having you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Bridget More, and I am the Communications and Community Education Coordinator with Be Not Afraid. I'm a mom of one, married for almost 25 years.
Wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit about Be Not Afraid?
Sure. So Be Not Afraid is a Catholic organization, a nonprofit that supports parents in carrying to term following a prenatal diagnosis. We offer a free comprehensive service of case management to any family who would like it. We follow the teachings of the Catholic Church, but we would take any family who wanted to come to us.
So what are some of the reasons that families would come to you? Like, what are some of the diagnoses that might come up?
We see a lot of babies with diagnoses that are potentially life-limiting. So trisomy 13, trisomy 18, anencephaly, heart defects. We don't get a lot of referrals for babies who have a diagnosis like, for example, Down syndrome. We do get some, but fewer. It tends to be the more life-limiting diagnoses.
And what are some of the things that these families, what does Be Not Afraid do in your work with them?
One of the big things that we do is we help with birth planning. So the family can prepare a birth plan and give it to their providers that talks about what they would like for their baby upon birth, what they would like during labor and delivery, what they would like done after birth. We usually, if it's a life-limiting diagnosis, we would typically help them plan for the scenario of if the baby did survive, if the baby did not survive. And then along the way leading up to that too, of course, we are with them to help interfacing with providers, with family, with grief support, even during the pregnancy. Just the idea of having lost the baby that they were expecting to have is a moment of grief. And then we stay with families for a year after the birth as well to offer whatever kind of support they would need, whether it's bereavement support, whether it's support negotiating life with a baby in NICU, which is something we're seeing more and more of now.
Yeah. So when you say life-limiting diagnosis, can you say a little bit more about what that means?
Sure. So we work very hard to take people away from using lethal language. So terms like incompatible with life or fatal fetal anomaly, things of that nature, because we don't know before a baby is born what an accurate prognosis could be. And we have found that sometimes very frail babies survive that no one expected would and grow and thrive. And so potentially life-limiting would be, something like a trisomy 13 or 18 that could presumably have a shorter lifespan, although not always as short as people would expect. There's a lot more survival than one would expect.
Yeah, so typically, what is the expectation of lifespan of many of these diagnoses, and then
Yeah.
how does that usually play out if there's a usual?
So there isn't a usual. Every baby really is unique. And this has been one of our focal points in the last couple of years, is particularly in a document that we wrote in consultation with the National Catholic Bioethics Center about the ethical treatment for babies for newborns with a prenatal diagnosis, one that has the potential to be life limiting, because you don't know until the child is born. And it's so important to do evaluations on the living child after birth and not make assumptions or care decisions, particularly decisions to limit care based on prenatal findings. We don't find a lot of misdiagnosis, but we do find a lot of misprognosis. Parents are almost inevitably given the worst case scenario at diagnosis, and that doesn't necessarily always play out that way. And what we're really finding is now that parents are using this document in particular, whether or not they're Catholic, by the way, to advocate for their child to be treated as any other child at birth, meaning that they'll be stabilized, they'll be evaluated, they'll have proper nutrition and hydration to sustain life. Wounds are bandaged, they're kept warm, things that are very standard that may not happen for a lot of babies with a prenatal diagnosis upon birth. We are finding we have a lot more babies in NICU. So babies that maybe in the past were not surviving to discharge, they are.
Wow.
And so we're really seeing what a difference it makes when the parents are advocating for stabilization and evaluation at birth, that the trajectory of the lifespan of a lot of these babies is different.
Wow. That's really powerful, especially if parents didn't have access to that information when they were preparing for the birth. So how did you come to be involved with work at Be Not Afraid?
Well, a number of years ago, I had really been just praying for God to tell me what he wanted me to do in my life. And he gave me a very specific call to help save babies with prenatal diagnosis. And about a year before that, I had read an article in my diocesan magazine about Be Not Afraid. And at the time, I had been struck by how peaceful the family profile seemed, despite the fact that their baby had a very serious diagnosis. And it was really impactful for me. And I never forgot that. And so then at this moment, when it was time to figure out a next step based on the call, I remembered that and eventually got in touch with Tracy Windsor, one of the co-founders, and it sort of went from there. And in my work, I don't do direct support for parents. I write and I do presentations and do social media. So it's more education for the community and for pro-life organizations and things like that.
Excellent. When you say you received a call, and that's very, very specific, how did that come about? And how did you know that that's what God was calling you to do?
Those were his words. So
in prayer then.
Out of the blue.
Okay.
Not really in a moment of prayer. Outside of a moment of prayer, he just said, you know what you can do for me. You can help save disabled babies.
Wow, like a St. Paul knocked off your horse kind of moment.
Pretty much. So after I stopped crying, I started to think about, okay, what does that mean? And what is a concrete step, and where do I go from here?
Wow.
And that had already know about Be Not Afraid. So
yeah,
that was where I eventually landed.
Yeah. So let's back up a little bit for thinking about people who are pregnant, they're excited about their children, and then they have this opportunity when they go in for their routine OB care and they're asked, do you want to have prenatal testing? And I think that covers a wide variety of tests, some of which are optional and some of which you don't really get a chance to say whether or not you want it. They say you're having this in most cases. So what is prenatal testing, and then what are some of the reasons to have it done or seek it out, especially when it's optional?
Well, you have touched on actually the first issue, which is that it's always optional. There is no test that parents can be required to do. And I think a lot of parents don't recognize that fact. And it has because it's so routine, parents don't understand that there's a decision to be made. And so right off the bat, informed consent is a real problem because parents often don't understand what the tests are for. They don't understand if they're diagnostic or just a screening test. They don't understand the potential outcomes of having the test. So for example, some really good questions parents should ask are, why would I have this test? Is it optional? What would be the outcome if you found that there was a concern? Would this in some way impact the care that I'm given or the care that my baby is given? Because parents don't know to ask those questions, and they really aren't able to give informed consent in a lot of cases. And it's particularly an issue because it is now coming up so early that it could very well be the first OB appointment. And the parent is right off the bat presented with, well, let's go ahead and do, this NIPT test right now, let's go ahead and get that scheduled now. And the parent, they're excited. This is all new to them. Maybe they don't even have a relationship yet with this doctor in particular, where they would be even comfortable asking questions or knowing to ask questions. Right from the beginning, that's a concern, moving the testing earlier like that. So, in general, parents want the test because they're looking for assurance that their baby is healthy, right? That's why most parents seek prenatal testing. That is not necessarily why providers offer it, however, because from the provider perspective, the advantage to offering first trimester screenings is that it makes abortion easier. Flat out, that's why. Second of all, they may be concerned that if they don't offer it and something turns out later that the baby had a disability that could have been detected prenatally, there may be some kind of liability for a wrongful birth suit. It depends on state law, but that's there. And one neonatologist that we work with has said, it's very telling that the default is that you do it. So if a parent says no thanks, they're marked as declining. So the default was that they would do it, and now they've declined, and so the physician is covered that he or she made the offer. So I think parents need to understand that from the get-go. So as far as the types of testing, they can be screening tests or they can be diagnostic tests. So the early tests that are done in the first trimester are screening tests such as, and we'll maybe talk a little bit more in depth about this one in a bit, but the non-invasive prenatal testing, which is also called cell-free fetal DNA testing, or NIPT, or NIPS for short. There's older testing like a quad screen or triple screen. That's not done as much. I think it's been pushed out more by the NIPT testing, but that would be an early screening test done with, often done with a nuchal translucency test to look at the back of the baby's neck as a marker for Down syndrome in particular. And then there is also CVS, which is chorionic villus sampling, which is another test that can be done as early as about 10 weeks. And that one is an invasive test with a risk for miscarriage, a small risk, but a real risk. And in that one, a sample, it's not a blood test, a sample is removed from the placenta, which is why there's the miscarriage risk. And it's interesting because CVS is billed as diagnostic, not screening, but there have been some recent studies coming out that are finding that sometimes it gives a false positive because it finds a problem that exists in the placenta, but not in the baby, which is very interesting. So that, for example, they've found genetic anomalies in the placenta, and then when the baby is born, the baby doesn't have that. It's not common, but it does happen. It can happen. And then the other test that is for sure diagnostic is amniocentesis, but that's a second trimester test that most people are probably pretty familiar with, in which a needle would be put in to draw fluid out of the amniotic sac for genetic testing. And that one, again, because it's invasive, there's a small risk for a miscarriage on that one as well. And then interestingly, ultrasound, I think people may not think about that as a test that looks for anomalies necessarily. I think a lot of people have ultrasound thinking that, they want to know the sex of their baby, and it just feels very routine. But most of our diagnosis stories of the families we served have started with ultrasound, in fact. And so it is important for parents to understand that it is looking for structural anomalies. And so just to be prepared for those findings if they decide to do it. Ultrasound, because it looks for structural issues, it can find concerns that could be addressed prenatally, or for example, maybe you'd find like the cord is wrapped around the neck, or baby is small for the weeks of growth. There are things that might come up in an ultrasound that could be beneficial to know for how the pregnancy is managed, or at birth, for example. With the genetic testing, however, the results do not provide information that can be acted on prenatally. There's no kind of correction, there's no surgical option, there's nothing that can be done with genetic test findings before birth. That makes the risk benefit, the balance is different. The risk benefit balance is very different on genetic testing. And we can maybe get a little more into this down the road when we talk about denial of care, but there's basically only risk actually to do it before birth.
Mm-hmm. So can we go back and talk a little bit more about cell-free fetal DNA testing?
Sure. So those are brand name tests that are very promoted. There will be brochures in the waiting room for these specific different tests. There are a few different manufacturers of these tests. There's a lot of money involved. They're expensive. Insurance generally pays for them. There was a study that was done by one of the companies that makes the test that showed for insurance companies, it was in their interest to pay for them because the long-term cost savings, if a child was found with a suspected disability and aborted, would save the insurance company money versus providing care for that child after birth. It's not in the best interest of the child, let's just say. What they do is it's a blood draw, and they're looking for evidence of chromosomal anomalies in the babies that's circulating in the mother's blood. So normally it would be Down syndrome, trisomy 18, trisomy 13. It can find out the sex of the baby as well. We have been finding recently, going back to informed consent, we've had some families who consented to the NIPT test just to find out the sex of the baby earlier than they could on ultrasound, without really understanding that it was actually primarily looking for chromosomal anomalies. They didn't understand that when they agreed to the test. So these tests, they advertise them as being 99% accurate, but what they're talking about is if a baby had, let's say a baby had Down syndrome, they're saying out of every 100 babies with Down syndrome, we would correctly detect 99 of them. Okay, but what's not factored into that number is that there's a huge false positive rate with these tests. So they might find the 99, and then they may find several hundred more and say that they have a positive result when actually the child is not affected by that particular disability. And the more rare the condition and the younger the mom, the more likely it is to be a false positive if she gets a positive test result. And some of them they're not even close. So 50% or more can be wrong, one study found. So for example, if you had a mom in her mid-20s with a positive result for trisomy 13, which is fairly rare, the likelihood of that being accurate is about 9%. So that would mean 9 out of 10 positive results would be false positives, roughly, for that age group and that diagnosis. So you really have to start to say, what is the benefit here when the false positive rate is so huge? And the benefit to the providers is first trimester abortion.
So just thinking about this from a mathematical standpoint, 9 out of 10 are false positives. And if we think about the number of babies who are aborted when they receive a positive diagnosis, I mean, we're talking about probably, I mean, definitely the majority of those
It's
being
about 80% is
there's
the average.
a likelihood that most of those, just mathematically speaking, from that
Yes.
false positive rate are healthy babies.
Yes, that's true. And that, that 9 out of 10 false positive would be for that example, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if it's an older mom with a Down syndrome diagnosis, it's going to be a higher false positive rate, but it's nowhere near this 99% number that they're hearing.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, providers don't necessarily understand that well either. So there's a lot of misinformation out there on this. The other thing is that there can be false negatives. So parents are going into this looking for reassurance of a healthy baby, but even if you get a negative result, it's not, again, it's only a screening. It's not 100%. You can't know for certain based on this that it's true. And another real concern is that for Catholic parents in particular who don't want to go with like an amniocentesis or a CVS because of the miscarriage risk, providers will often say, well, here's a non-invasive test you can do. But if there's a positive result, then of course the first thing they go to is, well, now we need a follow-up diagnostic. And so the very tests that she was trying to avoid by agreeing to this in the first place, now she's being pushed to do them all over again. There is literally no upside to do this test for for any parent, but for Catholic parents in particular, because the next step on a positive result is being pushed to these diagnostic tests she didn't want. And the reason to confirm is then going to be to push abortion. Right. And sometimes abortion is pushed even without a follow-up diagnostic.
So it seems like obviously seeking genetic counseling to determine whether to abort is not compatible with Catholic frame of mind.
Right.
But there might be other reasons that Catholics would want this information, and there might be a way that they could approach it in a way that is life affirming. Do you speak to that at all?
I'm going to say that typically parents aren't going to end up seeing a genetic counselor until after they've gotten test results or screening results. They're not normally going to be invited to meet with the counselor first. They're going to be given the test, and then if the results are concerning, then they're given to the counselor.
Okay.
So
what do those meetings look like then? If I'm coming in as a Catholic mother and I say, look, I'm not willing to consider abortion. Please don't bring it up. What do those meetings take place, or is the value of that really just to counsel abortion?
And what can they do? They can recommend more testing, depending on what you've gotten. If it was a screening test like a NIPT, they can say, okay, well, the next step then is to do amnio or CVS. Or they can say, here's your options to terminate. But it should also be known that they're not necessarily going to put it that bluntly. So a lot of times abortion is going to be couched in other language that softens it. So parents don't fully understand even what they're being asked to do. That's really important to understand, because a lot of parents who are Catholic, who are pro-life, who really would not abort, they can be talked into it because they don't really understand what's going on. If they're told their child has a diagnosis that's incompatible with life, and so we need to do this procedure, we need to say goodbye early. They don't necessarily come right out and say, let's terminate this pregnancy directly. That's very important to understand. So off the top of my head, I can't think of a life affirming example, to be honest with you, prenatally. After birth, certainly there could be value in understanding what if a child has a genetic anomaly, of course, you can see that. But prenatally, not really.
Yeah. So on the flip side of that, then we talked about a little bit about the physical risk. There's a risk of miscarriage with some of these tests, but it seems like there might actually be some other more nefarious risks. In the article that you wrote for the NCBC, you mentioned that there are some cases in which these tests actually result in a denial of care for some disabled patients. Could you share some of those stories?
Absolutely. So in that particular article, the two families who had agreed to share their stories, one was the Keiths, and their baby Oliver, an 18-week ultrasound They discovered brain cysts, and the doctors recommended a blood test to confirm if the baby might have trisomy 13 or 18, because the cysts were markers for that. And they said the reason was to ensure there would be a proper team assembled at Oliver's birth to provide appropriate care. And so the parents reluctantly agreed based on that. But then after the test was done and the results came back that he did have trisomy 18, they then used those results to say, oh, well, now he's not a candidate for the surgery we had talked about before. And furthermore, they wouldn't even provide basic care to mom, like fetal monitoring at birth, to see, to ensure that baby was a baby in distress, as you would normally. Anyone who's had a baby knows that you normally have fetal monitoring, right? To see if baby is in distress, might you need a C-section, what's happening. And so they wouldn't even do that. And his mom, Joy, said that she felt betrayed because they felt like they were promised a certain outcome from agreeing to the test, and then the exact opposite happened, that their baby was discriminated against because he had trisomy 18, and that the doctors just didn't consider him worthy to save once they knew he had a genetic anomaly. And so the other story that was shared was that of Kaylee Childers, and she also on ultrasound. So we see why we talk about things coming up first on ultrasound a lot of times, especially I think for the Catholic moms and the moms who aren't looking, or just Christian in general, who wouldn't be interested in some of the earlier testing necessarily. On the ultrasound, they found that she had some common heart defects, an ASD and a VSD. The VSD is the most common congenital heart defect, and it has excellent long-term prognosis following repair. So the parents were preparing for her to have a heart surgery. They had been told maybe around when she was 4 months that it wasn't super urgent, that they would let her grow a little bit first. So they were preparing themselves for their baby having a heart surgery. And they didn't have any genetic testing done prenatally. They had declined it all. But at birth, their baby had clenched fists and some other markers for trisomy 18. So they did genetic testing. And then after the testing results came back that she did have the trisomy, they were told she was no longer a candidate for surgery. And nothing had changed medically with her heart. It was because of the genetic condition. At that point, it was a judgment on what the value of her life was. And the judgment was that she was not worth trying to save, basically. And so the doctors at that point told the family they should cease medical care and that she needed to leave the NICU. They weren't going to keep her. And that she had been taking prostaglandin to keep her heart functioning in anticipation of having the surgery later before the testing results came in. And they wanted her to discontinue the prostaglandin. The parents on other counsel refused to do so, but they had to leave that hospital where she had been originally planned to have surgery. And they took her to a local regional hospital nearer to them, which didn't have the pediatric cardiac services available to do the repair. So they were just doing their best to keep her alive while searching for another hospital who would take her for surgery. But she died before they could find anyone who was willing to operate on her. Gosh. And as sad as these stories are, these specific stories, I really want people to understand that this is what we see. These are not isolated. They are more typical than atypical. That a genetic diagnosis is a reason for denying baby a treatment or a surgery that would be offered to another child with the same physical condition who didn't have the genetic syndrome. You see those wonderful stories, for example, about like repairs for spina bifida, that there have been some amazing even prenatal surgeries done for those. But one of the things they'll do is genetic testing. And if baby has, Down syndrome, for instance, which isn't even a life-limiting condition at this stage of the game, particularly those they typically will live into their 60s, right? At this point, they still would be denied that surgery.
Gosh, that seems huge violation of justice.
Yes. It's terrible. It's really terrible, and it's really, really common.
Who is it who's making these determinations about which infants deserve treatment or not based on their genetic conditions?
Well, I mean, largely speaking, I suppose it's the medical teams at the hospitals, right? It's the physicians. I mean, hospitals have ethics boards, but I don't think most of these cases go as far as an ethics board necessarily. It's more the individual physicians or teams of physicians. There have been studies done where they interviewed doctors and nurses about if they themselves had a child with various disabilities, what they would do, what their thoughts were on abortion, and overwhelmingly they would abort. So they're just doing, if the baby is not aborted, then the denial of care is the next step in that sequence once the judgment has already been attached to the child that their life isn't worth saving. And that's why the lethal language is so problematic, because it attaches this judgment to the child that their life is basically over anyways and not worth fighting to save.
Yeah, so it seems like parents who are hearing this and would not consider abortion want to give their child every chance at living the life that God has for them and not taking that life prematurely. It seems like these are kind of some scary, alarming situations, and that it would make sense to refuse all these genetic screenings just to protect their children. If we allow doctors and providers to have this information, and then the action that's taken as a result of that by providers or by insurance companies, by taking away the opportunity to have treatment for things that are unrelated to the genetic diagnoses. Does that make sense? Is that an alarmist way of looking at this? Do you think that's appropriate given what you see?
It's appropriate. It's absolutely appropriate. One study has found that the number one risk factor in determining if a baby with a genetic anomaly like a trisomy 13 or 18 will survive to leave the hospital and go home with their family is whether they were diagnosed before or after birth. It was a 2016 study, and they found that 36% of children diagnosed prenatally died in the first 24 hours, whereas only 1% of children diagnosed after birth died in that same time frame. And furthermore, they found that of the babies with the prenatal diagnosis, only 47% of them survived to go home to discharge, whereas 87% survived to discharge of the ones who were not diagnosed until after birth. And the difference is that when those babies are born and there's no diagnosis, what do? They treat them like any other baby at birth. During labor and delivery, mom is having all the usual options for fetal monitoring, for a C-section if necessary, for all of that. And then when the baby is born, the baby is treated like any other newborn. And so that is the biggest determinant. So there is just no advantage for the life of the child to do a genetic testing prenatally at this point, and because there is no treatment.
Yeah, do you know any of the stats on how long, if a baby does leave the hospital, how long their life typically can be?
There's some very interesting data on that. A 2016 study published in the American Journal of Medical Genetics found that babies who survived the first year of life with trisomy 13 or 18 had a more than 80% chance of living until age 5. And this was cited by neonatologist Dr. Marty McCaffrey here at the University of North Carolina, speaking at a conference in Dublin. And Dr. McCaffrey was saying how this was at odds with his medical school training, because he was taught that babies with these trisomies always died. But actually the 5-year survival rate for babies with trisomy 18, which is about a little over 12%, is similar to the 5-year survival rate for patients with lung cancer. But nobody says the patient with lung cancer is incompatible with life, so let's withdraw all treatment, right? They treat it as aggressively as they can, whereas these infants are routinely denied potentially life-saving or life-extending treatments. And it also varies a lot by location, which is something it's interesting. In a lot of ways, we don't know the potential lifespan really for children with some of these genetic anomalies because so few of them are allowed to live to find out. But increasingly, they're finding that when the children, for example, are given appropriate heart surgeries, that there have been some recent studies where they were surprised to find out that there was a significant benefit in terms of the longevity of the child's life. And it may be long-term that it's a little more like Down syndrome, wherein once upon a time, people with Down syndrome were thought to live to their 20s maybe, and now the life expectancy is into the 60s. So there's no question that there are significant cognitive impairments, right, with trisomy 13 or 18, but these children are still really valued members of their family, and they can actually live a lot longer than expected. That's why, again, saying this baby is incompatible with life is just not correct because no one knows.
So just to pick at that a little bit and to play devil's advocate. Somebody might look at those statistics and say, well, are you just extending a life that's full of suffering if going through these heart surgeries? What is the child getting out of this? Are they what is their quality of life like? Are you not really extending their life, but just extending their process of dying?
Mm-hmm. And that is the argument, right? That would be made against offering any kind of life extending or life saving treatments, right? For children with some of these more significant disabilities. But, we say that there is no baby so broken that he or she does not have a part in God's salvific plan. These children are loved members of their families. They add a lot to their families. So you can't base the value of a life on a number, right, of years. That's really profoundly un-Catholic, actually, for your listeners to understand, to say, well, only a person who lives X number of years has a life worth living. And I think it's incorrect to say that these are lives marked only by suffering. There's a lot of joy as well on the part of both the baby and the family. Mm-hmm. Just as every life is marked with joys and sufferings. They may be different, but every life has both.
Yeah. And I'm sure that you could find many parents who would say they'd give almost anything for if they've lost a child for one more day, one more minute, one more hour with that child.
Absolutely.
So really fighting for those potentially years is be huge if they know and are aware that that's something that they could be fighting for.
Yeah, definitely. And not every child is going to be the right candidate for every particular intervention. And we do, in Catholic bioethics, there is a distinction between what's ordinary care or extraordinary care, right? So each case might be unique, but it's having the possibility to even look at that, and that these decisions should be decisions made by parents, that these are not decisions that should be made summarily by hospitals against the explicit wishes of families.
Yeah, to dig a little bit deeper into this phrase, lethal diagnosis or incompatible with life, I think it's clear at this point in our conversation that is misinterpreted sometimes, and that you and the Be Not Afraid and other probably Catholic moral theologians use a different phrase. Can you say a little bit, remind us what that is, and say a little bit more?
Sure. So a more accurate phrase would be potentially life limiting, because, well, that's exactly what these diagnoses would be, right? Potentially life limiting, or life limiting even, depending, right? But to say it's incompatible with life is just not true. The child, first of all, is alive at that moment. And the implication is the child is dead or already in the process of dying, but this is a living person. So it's just false. And it gives the false impression that a doctor could make a prognosis prenatally about how the child will fare after birth. And they can't. They really can't, because there can be a lot of surprises once the baby is actually born. And if, for example, and we know that in other contexts. So if a child had, let's say they had a heart, problem with their heart, no genetic syndrome, just a problem with their heart, and they were going to be evaluated for surgery. Prenatally, they said, your child has this heart defect. We will plan to do a surgery, after the baby is born. Well, they're never going to do the surgery based off of the prenatal scans. They're going to take the living baby after birth, and they're going to do new scans, right? And that would be so for anything. You would never make decisions on care based on prenatal scans. And so it's the same for the babies who have trisomy 18 or, a more severe congenital heart defect or whatever the case may be, that we can't make good informed decisions prenatally. It's critical to evaluate the baby after birth. So the child needs to be stabilized and evaluated at birth, just like you would for any other baby. And that's kind of our mantra, to treat the child with a prenatal diagnosis the same as any other baby. That's really all parents are asking for.
So what are some of the things that you've learned from your work with Be Not Afraid?
A lot. One of them I already mentioned is that every baby has a purpose in God's salvific plan. There's no baby so broken that he or she does not. We've seen some quite amazing things. It's easy to imagine the impact that these children have on their parents, on their siblings, on their extended families. But we've also seen some really beautiful stories about how the impact they had on doctors who got to know them. And a couple of particular ones, we recently heard about one wherein a physician had been just a medical student, I guess a resident at the time, that one of the families Be Not Afraid supported was preparing for birth, and they had written a birth plan, and it had been circulated amongst the staff so that everyone understood, and this young resident he said he wrote to them later and said, I wasn't on your child's case at all, but he never forgot it. He was so impacted by it that it changed his outlook going forward on children with disabilities. And another remarkable story was one in which the parents there had been a doctor in the practice where they were who was very hostile to them caring to term their baby. Very, very hostile. And there were several physicians in the practice, and they were just praying that she would not be the one when they came time to have their baby. So they had their baby, and I guess another physician delivered, but she came in the room shortly after this baby was born, and they kind of went, oh no, here she comes. And she just said, can I hold your baby? And they said she sat in the rocking chair in the nursery with the baby and just wept. So I think that's just a remarkable part of it, that you would never even imagine, right? The impact, not just on the families, but on so much bigger, and changing the hearts of others. And, the other thing that I've learned is that can be so much peace and joy for parents in carrying their baby to term when they're empowered to parent them to the best of their ability, no matter what the outcome is going to look like in the end. It's amazing, actually, to see the peace, the trust that some of these families have in God, and the joy that they have at the end of the day, no matter what happens.
Yeah. Do you know of any studies that look at the difference of how, especially mothers with families, feel who have carried their children to term versus women who've chosen abortion?
Absolutely. There are significant mental health benefits to the mothers who carry to term. In the long term, the mothers who did carry to term have much lower rates of PTSD-like symptoms, and they return to baseline mental health more quickly. So there is a psychological benefit to them. The other thing that we've really been learning about a lot in the last couple of years is that the experience of the diagnosis itself is experienced as trauma and like meets the medical definition for trauma for parents at that moment, which is one more reason that having, first of all, that they shouldn't be pushed to make quick decisions as they so often are at time of diagnosis, because they are traumatized people and they should be treated as such. And that's why another reason why the benefit of having the comprehensive support as they carry to term is it really makes a huge difference in their outcomes.
Going back to those early blood tests, a lot of people, I think, are, kind of outsourcing those blood testing companies to tell them the gender really early on.
Mm-hmm.
Are any of those tests available specifically and only on the gender, or are all of those tests testing for that, or do you know if
they're all testing?
They're all testing.
They're all really, the gender is like a nice add-on. The checking the sex of the baby is not the primary function of these tests. Mm-hmm. The primary purpose is looking for genetic syndromes.
So would it be possible to get those early blood tests to find out just the gender and only the gender? You wouldn't be able to kind of keep that information from your provider?
I don't think so. I shouldn't think so, because it's going to be the provider who is ordering the tests. And these tests cost thousands of dollars too, by the way. So, I mean, the reason it's purely curiosity. It's purely curiosity, right? To know like a little bit earlier. Like, let's say the parent was comfortable with ultrasound. Okay, so you're going to find out a little bit earlier if your baby is a boy or a girl. But it's not worth it for the risks that come along with getting other knowledge that you may or may not want to have at that point, if it's even accurate.
Yeah. So what would you tell parents who have just received this trauma causing difficult diagnosis for their little ones, or who might even be, on a separate note, might not even want to conceive because they are worried maybe they have something genetic in their bloodline that they're worried about? What are some of the things you might say to either of those couples?
To the parents who are facing a difficult diagnosis, the thing that we always tell them is that the diagnosis day is the train wreck. That's the worst day. People think that the birth is going to be the hardest time, especially if there's a potential for a losing baby at birth, but it's not. It's the diagnosis day. And so it really does get better from there. That is the first thing that we would want them to know, that you've already experienced the worst part, because that's the moment they're hit with that trauma, right? And that's the train wreck. So that would be the first thing that we would tell them. We would also really want them to understand that parents who carry their baby to term after a diagnosis do not regret that they chose so. In our Be Not Afraid surveys, 100% of parents say that they would encourage other parents in their same situation to carry to term. And there was a study a few years ago that found that the experience of carrying to term was empowering and even transformative for moms in particular, and that they cherished every moment they had with their baby. So they will never regret carrying to term. That's something we would really want them to know, and that it really can be an empowering and transformative experience. And then in either group of a parent, we would really want them to know that God does not send you a baby to destroy you. So whether you're dealing with the heartbreak of a diagnosis, or whether you're just afraid of what could happen, God is not going to send you a baby to destroy you. And so anytime having a baby, there's an act of trust, right? There's always trust. You can't control everything. I think that's a really hard lesson for us, all of us, right? American women. You can't control everything. And that's a big piece of the letting go of like those NIPT tests, because the instinct is to say, I just want to be prepared. So if something should be wrong, I would like to be prepared. But that desire to be able to prepare and control the circumstances there, it would lead, statistically, it's going to lead for a worse outcome for your baby. So it's just, you have to be willing to let go, which is, it's hard to let go of control, right? But at some point we just have to.
Well, it's not possible to prepare for all of the disasters. It's probably better just to meet the ones that come that do, and just save your energy for those, because those will be enough.
That's why we don't see everything that's ever going to happen our whole life at once, right? Which is actually another thing that I know that we do talk to parents about. Like, you don't have to know everything that's going to happen in your child's life forever. Don't worry about if your baby's going to, what their adult life is going to look like. Just parent the baby in front of you right now, right? One step at a time, which actually is one of the reasons that when parents are in an early decision point for those who are deciding whether or not to carry to term or abort, we generally don't recommend connecting them to other parents who have older children with that diagnosis at that point when they are deciding, because sometimes seeing the day on the road can be so frightening when really they just need to get through tomorrow. They don't need to see, the scars of the heart surgeries. They don't need that right now.
Yeah.
Because it's overwhelming if you see the whole picture at once, right?
Very different to see someone else's child facing
100%
a struggle than to see your own.
100%. Absolutely true.
Well, is there anything else that we have talked about, or that we haven't talked about, that you would like to share or comment on?
When we were speaking about genetic testing and is there a Catholic frame of mind to approach it, I would just like to share with the listeners a couple of quotes from church documents. Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life, says that that Catholics are strongly warned against an underlying, this is the quote, eugenic intention that presumes to measure the value of a human life only within the parameters of normality. And the church document Dona Vitae states that a diagnosis must not be the equivalent of a death sentence. So those are really important for everyone to understand. And then also in the question of, isn't more information better? We touched on that a little bit just now about how you can't control every outcome, but also one thing that's going on increasingly now is something called microarray testing, in which they will do genetic testing to look at the baby for microdeletions genetically, but they'll return results that they have no idea if there's any clinical significance or not, because all these microdeletions have not been studied or mapped. And you and I could be walking around with a bunch of them and have no idea. They may be of no clinical significance at all. There was a study on that wherein parents, they said that they wanted to know as much as possible. So they underwent these microarray testings, and then they later came to call it toxic knowledge. They wish they never had it, and they couldn't undo it because the results weren't meaningful. There was no key to interpretation to learn about a micro deletion that you had no one had studied. So they have this knowledge, and that they would be so distressed for the rest of their pregnancy. But even afterward, the ones whose babies were born with no health concerns, they would still feel like, going on from after birth, they still feel like they're waiting for the other shoe to drop, forever. So
what even
more is
would
not
be the
better.
point of doing that kind of test on an unborn baby? I could see doing it on adults, so you could have that information to see, but that reminds me of they did this study in worked in education for a while, and they did this study with children, and they would tell the teachers, it'd be a random group of kids, either way, no differences in their skills.
Yeah.
But they would tell the one teacher, oh, this is a gifted group. These kids are really going to excel. Like, you got the smarty kids. Good for you. And then they tell the other teacher, same, like a random group, no differences in the skill. They tell the other teacher, oh, these kids are really struggling. They're behind, they have deficits, and they would have marked significant differences in their improvement, in their scores, and just in their performance. No differences in the levels of the kids, just in the minds of the teachers. The teachers perceived the kids differently, and they treated them differently because they perceived them differently. So I can only imagine, like, as a parent, having information of, well, there might be something wrong because that I don't know what that means, and I don't know if it corresponds. You might treat your children differently because of that information.
I think for the parents, it was more the feeling of just like anxiety that they couldn't get over. But for the doctors, it's exactly what you're describing, right? They're coming into with a deficit mindset. Like there's a problem here, right? And when there's a prenatal diagnosis that can't be dealt with prenatally, then suddenly the problem you're solving is the pregnancy. That's the perspective of the providers, and that's why abortion is so strongly offered, because that's how they think they can solve the problem at that point, when there's nothing they can do prenatally for baby.
Especially when all that the providers typically get to see is sort of the moment in time when things are really difficult for parents with these kids. You know, they watch them, hold them, and they see them die if they have that, or they just see the struggles, but they don't see the love or the absence of regret or the transformative things that these studies allow us to have insight into for these families down the line. They only get to see the heartbreak and the difficulty.
That's one of the benefits for providers when they see these babies who were diagnosed, they were not diagnosed prenatally, that they've spent some time with these infants, they've gotten kind of to know them, and that can also change their perspective on babies with those genetic syndromes overall, more broadly, because it's really important to understand that even now doctors they're taught that these are incompatible with life. They're taught that these babies can't live. And so that's their training. But when they get to know an infant who does live, that is a different kind of training, right? Yeah. It makes a difference. It really can. But a lot of them won't meet them because they're going to immediately suggest abortion, unless the parent has the right support in carrying to term. Whether they're Catholic, whether they're pro-life, most of them will not carry to term. And so then it's sort of self-perpetuating. So they say the child is incompatible with life, the child's life is ended. So then of course the doctor goes on thinking it's incompatible with life because they've never met a living child with this particular diagnosis.
Right. Speaks a lot to the need for a value shift in the education of our physicians and healthcare professionals. That we can't really sanitize out ethics and values and sort of make that a neutral place. We need to have really good discussions, and pro-life discussions need to be a part of the medical training of physicians, especially because otherwise they're going to be trained with a different set of values. There's no way to get the values out. Somebody's values are going to be training your professionals.
It can't be neutral. There's nothing neutral. And so that's where the value of an organization like APLOG, it's the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, that's where an organization like them is so valuable. Their reason for existence is to encourage and equip medical practitioners to provide an evidence-based rationale for defending the lives of both the pregnant mother and her unborn child. Whereas the bigger professional organization that most OBs belong to they are explicitly pro-abortion. So that's how and people follow their standards. Right. You know, doctors think these are the standards, we have to follow these standards. So yeah, a different training is much needed. And actually, speaking of training, there was one other thing I did want to mention. So over the years, Be Not Afraid has gotten more and more referrals, self-referrals, or referrals from other sources of parents. And it has always been our mission that we would serve whoever God sends with no limitations. But we, in recent years, have really been hitting the limits of what is possible with the amount of people we have actually doing the work. And so, and we support not just in a locality, but nationwide. And actually, even we've had some international families in recent years because there's nothing where they are. And so this year, we have started an initiative called the Safe Passage Project that was part of, we were in the OSV Challenge this year, and we made it to the semifinalist round. And the goal of the Safe Passage Project then is to be able to put together a comprehensive training program so we can train other organizations to provide the B&A model of case management, to expand the workers in the vineyard, as it were, to reach a lot more families, because the need is ever growing, but we are not.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely offering support for that. And how else can listeners contact you, support your organization?
The easiest way would be on our website, which is benotafraid.net. And if they're interested in making a donation to support the work of Be Not Afraid and the Safe Passage Project to expand the reach, that is just benotafraid.net/donate, or there's a button on the homepage. There's also an organization that relies on great support from volunteers. We have prayer sponsors. We have volunteers who create memory making articles. So someone makes personalized blankets for every baby. Someone smocks little burial gowns for babies who don't live. We have bereavement support ministry. So we're always definitely in need of volunteers who would like to support in that way, or volunteers who would like to do fundraisers. That's always very helpful. And then on social media, both Be Not Afraid and Safe Passage Project have Facebook and Instagram. And so it's certainly to follow and to share our posts. One thing we've got going right now in particular is we've started a particular initiative to really work on educating the pro-life community why we need to stop using lethal language, because it's just so ingrained in the vocabulary that we see it all the time in articles written by, people who are 100% pro-life, and they don't understand that they're using the language really of the enemy, of someone who is working at cross purposes to them. And so we really want to get the word out that we just have to stop using that language, because it's not true, and it puts babies at risk.
All will be well, and all will be well. All will be well, and all will be well, and all will be well.
Special thanks to Jessica Gerhardt for her track, All Will Be Well. This season of Brave New Us is sponsored by my book, Reclaiming Motherhood from a Culture Gone Mad. It is out and available for purchase. It's been having a pretty good run. The publisher sold out on the first day, and it was listed as the #1 new release in Christian ethics on Amazon. It's back in stock now, so you can go ahead and grab a copy if you haven't already. Thank you to those of you who have left reviews. Amazon has actually locked those down now, and I'm pretty sure my account has one of those Twitter bans. Either that or the internet finds me completely humorless and uncompelling. Both seem likely at this point. But what this means is that I need your help more than usual. Please help get the word out, both about this book, but also about the podcast. Our guests and organizations like Be Not Afraid are doing monumentally important pro-life work, and getting the truth out there in this culture gone mad is more of an uphill battle than ever before. So thank you for all you've been doing and all you will do to share this book and podcast with everyone you know. Thank you. God bless.